Today I will talk for our course The Past at Play about a specific subgenre in which the past often is a trope. Explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. This is a particular subgenre of strategy games, video games that can be, but also board games such as settler games. And they are often turn-based, but can be real-time as well, in which real-time means that time continues even if you don't play, while turn-based is only time continues when you take a turn, as it may be quite self-explanatory, actually. What is interesting about these games is that they are often set in a past, historically set, and in that past often post-colonial actions take place, like managing your empire, conquering and mastering lands, and also ideologies of colonization often frequently figure in those games. In that sense, one could say, even if they are mixed with ethnicities, etc., or where they are taking place, that whole ideology of colonization makes them rather Western or Eurocentric. They also, within that perspective, have sort of are imbued with ideas of a particular kind of economy, a market rationality, and also ideas about resource extraction. So how do we treat the earth, and how in colonization or practices of colonization other territories are used to extract resources which are expensive, like iron, but also other stuff. The Four Axes is a subgenre of strategy games, and as it already gives away, it's about exploring, it's about expanding, it's about exterminating and exploiting. And that makes it, of course, very close to what colonization, or the sort of discovery, which is, of course, a very problematic word, of new worlds is about. One should note here that the 4X thing is going back quite a long way. Of course, in computer games, it started to become a thing, or named as this genre, around the 90s, late 80s as well. But it's based on things or game mechanics which also appear in text-based games, but also in board games, as the settler games I just mentioned allude to as well. One famous computer game, which has a long history already in itself now, which deals with the 4 axes, is Sid Meier's Civilization, and many of you may have played it, or at least have heard about this game. As you can see here as well on this picture, it figures a map in the corner, it figures a territory, and then there's also the white territory outside, which has not been explored yet. Again, already a thing which gives away a certain idea about where you haven't been as a ruler doesn't exist yet. And in older civilization versions, that territory outside what was explored was black, like that was the terra incognito. Now it's white, which is an interesting change. But anyway, if you look at the website of Civilization 5 in this case, of course, there's now Civilization 6 as well, and the title already gives away so much in this case. The game really centers around becoming the ruler of the world, so the most omnipotent leader. And you do that through establishing and leading a civilization from the dawn of man into the space age. Again, very much this idea of evolution and also progress, technological progress. And you do that also through waging war, conducting diplomacy as well, and discovering new technologies. So discovering, not developing, and going head to head with some history's greatest leaders and building the most powerful empire the world has ever known. So the four axes are definitely at work in this game. But what are those games about as cultural artifacts? What do they do with us as players, or what do we players do with those games in regards to the past? There's been some people, some authors who have written about this, and one of the first two authors who wrote about this phenomenon of being the explorer and the, through exploration or colonization, becoming the leader of the world or the master of the world. And two of these authors who did already write about this in 1995 are Henry Jenkins and Mary Fuller. And indeed, they already make a very strong link between spatial, the spatial nature of those games, learning to master space, literally filling in space, as the other slide of Civilization 5 showed so clearly. But through learning to master space, space is created. So it is as if that space hasn't been there before you have set foot on it, which is, of course, a trope you often see in colonial stories and histories. You know, the whole idea that, for example, Australia was an unexplored and untainted even territory, erasing or not seeing at all that there were already people living there, so that space was already there. And what is important in my talk today in those spaces, and that relates to the past again, are hybrid but also cultural spaces. They're contested spaces in which we try to make sense of what the past of colonization means nowadays. Interestingly, in this article, which is still very, very valuable to read, I would say, Mary Fuller, who is specialized in New World travel writing, and Henry Jenkins, who is a cultural studies scholar, go into debate or dialogue about how does this sort of endeavor of playing these games resonate with literature about travel writing from a couple of centuries ago. In this lecture, I will give a lot of thought for you, or things you could reflect upon about how we can call such 4X games post-colonial in how they treat the spaces and how those spaces are cultural hybridized spaces. So let me first make clear what I mean by post-colonial here, because if some of you may be a bit familiar with post-colonial studies, it's quite a broad and very interdisciplinary field. And in that field, there are also many definitions about what post-colonialism means. And they're not necessarily that you have to agree or disagree or choose or pick one. But I think for computer games, one is more applicable than the other two. And that's the third one. Let me first go to this, the first and the second one to explain this further. So there's one definition, according to Nash as well, of post-colonialism, which is very much focusing on the former colonized people and nations. And in a way, in our lecture and course class later in this course, we also talk about that when we talk about indigenous games. But one prevailing definition really focuses on how colonized people and nations deal with their colonial past and celebrate the end of colonialism. A very important definition indeed for when you want to study former colonized people specifically. Then there's another circulating definition of post-colonialism that emphasizes the reproduction of colonialism in the present as a means of its continuation. So this definition in a way assumes or thinks that colonialism isn't finished yet, but is still present, but maybe in less tangible ways. And a good example, I think, of this is the whole debate at the moment about decolonizing the curriculum, in which the thought is that actually our curriculum, so the things you read for courses like this course, are still highly colonial, but are not seen as such because they are often, for example, written by white Western men. So the term decolonizing the curriculum actually assumes that post-colonialism is about that this is still reproduced, although we are not aware of that. That may all be the case. Both definitions have their value. But when we talk about the post in post-colonialism in regards to games, we move actually in a more complex or hybrid space in which it could be, but it is not necessarily a celebration of the end of colonialism. And it also, anyway, it's not simply the case that it reproduces the colonial in the present. Some people may say that, but if you look at these games and what they do, the past is often mutated, impure, and it's unsettling legacies of colonialism by, for example, that you being able to play with a Zulu leader, which is not, of course, ever what really took place in history, literally. So the definition, which is interesting when we talk about games, sees post-colonialism as not a celebration, not a reproduction, but as a hybridization, how things from the past still resonate and are present in the present. And that's an interesting definition when it comes to computer games, or actually one could say for all digital media maybe, because in the last definition, the accent shifts to post-colonialism as a more complex term, and also as a term that deals with how inheritances of colonial cultures reverberate in contemporary culture in hybridized and transformed ways. And I would say that games have an exceptional sort of status or strength or potential to do this and to play with the heritage of colonialism, literally play with it. And that's not only because we play with things, so this what if, this experiment is very important in play, but it is also because, like, and again, that's what I just said in another way, we have far more agency in creating spaces and environments and how they take shape when we talk about computer games. The whole interactive quality of digital media makes it possible to mess things up, and it's exactly that messing of things up which is so close to this definition of post-colonialism. Another example of a game, in this case Age of Empires, in which you see how space and the sort of messing about and merging of spaces is important. And I want to draw special attention here to how you again see the map, in this case in the left corner, and the territory, the landscape, which you discover in the main part of the screen. Because something interesting is happening here. And some of you may remember in an earlier lecture I talked about the Certeau and about how there is this friction between how space is represented and how we experience space. How space is represented is often in objectified representations, like in this case for these kind of games, very importantly, maps, right? So the information is sort of rendered in a rational way in which the territory is sort of not even made abstract, but sort of rendered in a geometrical form. Then on the other hand, we have the way in how we experience space, how we move through space, in this case as a player. So here we talk about the point of view of the narrator, or in the cases of games, how we make spatial stories by moving through the game. What you often see in this kind of subgenre is that the difference between the map and the tour becomes more problematic, because what you do in the map, literally, also translates in what you do in the territory and vice versa. So one could say that these sort of games, but actually games in general, have sort of hybridized the different positions of what de Certone calls the map and what he calls the tour, and that the objectified and subjectified become less tenable as separate entities. So what's the function of these post-colonial games, and how does this really relate to the past and the personal past of you as a player making these spatial stories? Now, my answer would be that yes, we have these temporal spatial hegemonies, so power relations, which according to the second definition we repeat over and over again. And whether you agree with that or not, when we talk about games, we play with that power relation. It doesn't become a stabilized thing anymore, but it's exactly the probing of those power relations, what we're doing in a very light way. You could say on the one hand, it's fun to play, but because of that, it frees space up for us to really, be less serious about it, in a way, one could say, and through that, changing those sort of past power relations into something more personal, subjective, and also anachronistic. You can play with time in these games. So I would say that in these games you can speak of an hybridization of temporal relations. Things become merged, borders become less strongly defined. And as a player, you are actually endowed with the power of marking territories and empires, and you can thus create your own personal post-colonial story. So actually there's this sort of translation, and of course hybridization and translation are as words quite strongly related. You translate world histories into personal stories. And in that process, of course, those big colonial histories become mutated and altered because they become personalized. And our colonial legacies are being tested, scrutinized, and transformed. Again, this relation between experiment and play, which you see in here. So the writers I'm talking about, like Jenkins, have been talking about the cultural and the social functions of post-colonial tropes and games. Now, there are many different approaches to this, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I want to give you some of them so you have a bit of an idea when you want to write about social cultural functions, or you want to think further about social cultural functions of post-colonial tropes in games. Well, one, and Jenkins wrote about that, Douglas, but also I wrote about that, relates the post-colonial era as a space where space and identity are determined by colonial history, but are not the colonial history itself. Jenkins and also Douglas puts an interesting point forward, and I think it's a valid point in certain games or certain analysis of games, that it is about a nostalgia as well. And as we know, and we mentioned this before, I think, the past is a foreign country. The past is something which didn't exist, maybe. So nostalgia is very much this idea of longing for a past which was never there, right? It's also always romanticized in a way. So it's a nostalgia for new frontiers, very much a more American, Northern American white Western idea, and open spaces. And that idea of Jenkins about open spaces is interesting when we talk now at this moment during COVID-19, because he says that because urbanization and spaces becoming more crowded, that there's less and less space outside to play, so we play in games. And that, of course, has been it became more palpable during this crisis, when people were sort of often in lockdown and had limited space to move around, and indeed also that caused a surge in people playing games, so finding that open space somewhere else. Then another sort of approach or way of thinking about what happens in those games is that it also is a way of making sense of globalism, because we live in a globalized world and things change drastically and quickly, but also it's very difficult to analyze that or to understand that world we live in. And actually globalism is, of course, a result, in a way one could say, of, at least it is associated with post-colonialism. So the globalized world we live in is again, I used the word before, messy and complex, and these sort of games give us a way to playfully think about how that relates to colonialism and where we stand, so to speak, as persons. Another interesting way of approaching is that actually the space in these games is quite uniform. It's quite simple in a way even, right? You just explore that territory and their borders, and there's a correspondence between the map and the territory. On the other hand, maybe that uniformization of space gives us space, again, to play with time, so to make time anachronistic. And that is, of course, in relation to this course, an interesting thought to keep in mind. Now, the definitions or approaches I just mentioned to ritual, to games, to these post-colonial games, actually work from the idea that games can be seen as a kind of ritual space. And here we're back with Huizinga again and his magic circle, which is clearly also a way to see games as ritual spaces. But when I specify that, and more from a cultural studies perspective, actually harking further back to other ideas of how we can understand popular culture, it is actually this idea that there are a lot of frictions and paradoxes in our cultures and societies, which and they are difficult to make sense of. And what games do, but also other fictional media, you could say, they offer a space in which we can safely give meaning to those frictions or play around with those frictions. And in this case, we want these sort of games give us the opportunity to think in the present, in our contemporary culture, about what the results are of our, in our case, our past actions, colonial actions, you could say. And so you can also think about games as Prince of Persia, which are not part of this genre. This also includes ideas about Orientalism, the othering, as some of you may have read or have heard of Edward Said and his work. And also it gives us the opportunity to hybridize cultures. And we do live, of course, in a culture in which we are from different backgrounds living together. So we do live in the present in a hybridized culture, which is also the result of this past actions. Now, how to research this? I already mentioned that this is a subgenre, and there are many other games which also play with post-colonial, or play with the past and play with colonialism in the past. When it comes to post-colonialism and how to research this, there are different ways to do this, and I'm listing some important ones here. Of course, there's the close analysis of gameplay, and you can do this analysis from different disciplines or fields. You can, for example, do it more from a formalistic approach, but you can also use cultural analysis for this analysis. You can also do it, and we do that in a light way in this course through live streaming. And while you live stream, you comment on what's happening. And that's a very interesting form of researching it, because games are only there when you play them, and it allows you to really put those two things together. You can also do interviews, of course, with players, or maybe even with designers or makers of games. You can also observe people playing, what we, for example, do in the Pass It Play lab with very old games. You can also compare what happens in games with other media, like cinema, for example. You can also play the game as a researcher, and I will come back to that in a moment when I talk about the last one in this list, autoethnography. And you can also do this through designing, or maybe designing things in a different way. So there's a term for that, research through design. So by, for example, what you do with the Twine, by designing a game, you can also use that as a methodology almost, or as a methodology, a playful methodology, to think differently about what post-colonialism is, for example, through an indigenous perspective, or through a queered perspective. And then the last one, autoethnography, which has to do very much with playing. You can, as a player, put yourself in your analysis through making notes of what it is to play this game. And that's actually what we very much ask you to do in this course when you write some of your vignettes. Now, as you may be aware or not, both Angus, Iris and I are very much interested in these post-colonial games from our different fields and disciplines we work from. So here are, you see the pictures as well, Iris and Angus, and they also wrote about Civilization 6 from the Stone Age to the Information Age, in which they take a more historical, archaeological, reflective analysis of, or standpoint to analyze Civilization 6. Then there's also my own work together with Stephanie de Smale, in which we indeed do this autoethnography, but we don't only do this autoethnography, but we make it a collaborative autoethnography, because it is a turn-based game. So we use that turn-based feature to write about reflexivity and mapping and hybridity in Civilization 6. So these are just two examples of the ways in which you can write and think and analyze post-colonialism in games. So, to conclude, as you may be very aware, not only because of this lecture, but also in other lectures, post-colonial play can be researched from many different angles, and actually it doesn't stop with these 4X games. You can also do it with other games. You can also actually analyze board games this way, for example. What post-colonial play is about, it's not about the accuracy of past facts, but more about experiencing the past. How do you play with the past? Again, the what if. It gives you the space to probe the past and the colonial past as well. Post-colonial play allows for the hybridization of perspectives from different players, from the choices you make, and as such it offers us a very rich cultural source for playing with the colonial past. Thank you.